All right, so this is a project that I've been working on for a little bit. I've been modernizing a Craft 3 website. I've Dockerized it. I've added a Webpack 5 build process to it. I've set up, converted all the JavaScript over to be loading from NPM packages rather than just being downloaded. We're using a nice modern CSS system with Tailwind CSS that we retrofitted. And I actually just retrofitted the JIT, the newly released just-in-time compiler for Tailwind CSS to it too. Got all that up and running, and I did a couple of little optimization things, and then we are live. So again, this is a website that somebody else created for a friend of his, and I helped him out with a little bit, and then the website was, unfortunately, the VPS was deleted. Guy forgot about the credit card that was on it or whatever, and I managed to have a copy of it that was sitting on one of my old machines, so I said, sure, I'll help you get it back up and running, but I wanted to modernize a few things first. So here it is. So if you want to check it out, it's kerry-brown.com. It's up there and it's live. And the way that we have this set up is via Laravel Forge, is what provisioned the DigitalOcean server. And then we have, a buddy.works pipeline that actually does the atomic deploy when we deploy this. And I'll have a link to how all that works in the description of the video. And in fact, yeah, we can take a look at that real quick. So let's say that we wanted to deploy this thing. Let's get this up here. All right, so this is Git Tower. Let's say that we wanted to deploy this thing, and what you really should do is you should use Git flow, and you should do a release, and you should do all this kind of stuff. I'm doing this just to make it quick. But basically, I'm just going to merge the develop branch into master. Has a minor change that I put in there. I'm going to push it. Okay. And we pushed it. All right. I always switch back to develop so I don't check any changes in by accident. But now you'll notice that buddy.works immediately picks up the fact that a push was made to master. And it's going to go through the steps of deploying it. So it prepares the environment. It's going to do the Webpack build in a container. It's going to do the composer install here. And then this is a key thing. I see a lot of people using atomic deployment tools, but they're not using rsync to then copy the resulting files to their VPS. They're using FTP. And you really probably want to use rsync because it will do a couple things for you. One is it will accelerate the speed at which it can deploy stuff because it compresses everything on the way down the pike. And then the other thing, the really big gain, is that it will only copy over the stuff that's changed, right? So if we're constantly doing deployments, if you're using FTP, it's going to redeploy the entire site every time. For big sites, this can take like a half hour. If you use rsync, it'll be super quick, and it'll just do the deployment right there for you, and only deploying the files that have changed. And it keeps a cache in the cloud, right, of what has changed. So just as an example, we can see that Webpack is just doing its thing here. It's building the favicons, it's doing all that kind of fun stuff. We're just going to let this run. The reason why I actually wanted to do this is I wanted to show you a couple of kind of tricks that I put in there along the way. So one of the fonts that he's using is from Google Fonts. So it's this anonymous pro font. And there are two things that I added to this that I think are worth noting. So one is I added this ampersand display equals swap. And what this does, so this is the CSS property font display. And it will set in the CSS that is returned to you from Google Fonts, it will set font display to swap. And you might say, well, why am I doing this? Well, what this will do is it won't block the render of the page waiting for this font. It will render it in some other font, and then it will swap in the Google font whenever it is eventually loaded asynchronously on the page. And that's nice because instead of staring at a blank screen, people are going to be looking at the page. The font will be different, but that's okay. It'll be swapped in as soon as it's loaded. So I wanted to show you that. And then the other thing I wanted to show you is, and this is a little trick from the Filament group, in terms of how to async load a style sheet. So we don't really want the rendering of our page to be blocked trying to just load this CSS from Google, because we're loading the font async anyway. So what we really would like to do is not block the render waiting for this CSS to come in, but instead load it asynchronously. So the rest of the page can load and parse and do all that kind of stuff. So the folks at the Filament Group came up with a clever no JavaScript way, well, minimal JavaScript way to do this, which is you set the media attribute to print, which obviously doesn't apply to the screen, right? Because it's a print. And then you set the onload handler to change the media to all once the style sheet is actually loaded. So effectively, the style sheet will async load, and as soon as it is loaded, it will change the media to all, which will then apply the style sheet to our page asynchronously, which is kind of nice. The other thing that I wanted to show you here is I have these two link rel equal preload things here. So what this page is using, and actually let's switch to the development version of this page. So this is running live. Actually, we'll see more here because I have the developer tool shown. But he's using something called masonry, which is using some JavaScript that then affects the layout. And there can be a little bit of weirdness. You see that? I just did a shift reload to force it to reload. You can see it kind of redrawing stuff. Because he's using JavaScript to do the layout, which is not a wonderful thing, but fixing it would involve switching everything over to grid and doing a bunch of work that I'm not prepared to do right now. But we can make it a little bit better by using this preload. So what this is saying is, and this is using TwigPack just to pull out the URL to these two JavaScript files. It's saying load this, or preload this runtime.js and this app.js. And what that effectively does is it bumps these things to the front of the line. We want these to load as quickly as possible. And we can see it right here in our waterfall. So we did a load and it loaded, the first thing it loaded was a document, but then right after that is the runtime.js and the app.js. And we want to prioritize these things loading because they are going to be used to lay out the stuff and move the layout around. And layout shift is not a wonderful thing, so the quicker and the earlier we can do it, the better. So there's just a little tip. I mean, obviously you can't preload everything because then nothing would be preloaded, if that makes sense. But if you have a couple of resources that you know really need to be preloaded or really need to be loaded ahead of time, you can use this link rel equals preload. And let's just take a look at what it looks like if we don't do it. So now that we remove them, we shift reload it, and you can see in the waterfall now some other stuff is loading first that we may or may not care about. Yeah, so that's that. And then there was one other thing. We're just going to put that back in. All right. So there's one other thing I wanted to show real quick, and this is just using responsive image source sets and using WebP. So this is our logo image, and it's actually the one that is used for, yeah. So it's this image right here. It's used on mobile. And you can see what we're doing is we're doing image source, and we're just, outputting the image here. No big deal here. But then we also have these two sources, and the browser will parse the sources in the order that you put them. So if you have any optional things like WebP is optional, not all browsers support it, you would want to put those first to give the browser a chance to default through that if it doesn't support it. So what it's going to do is it's going to try to use the WebP if the browser supports it, and it uses a source set, so we've got nicely sized images for each display size. And if it can't use the WebP, let's say you're using an older browser that doesn't support it, well, then it can use the source set that is just provided here, which is just the regular JPEGs, or actually in this case, I think the regular PNGs, again, sliced up at different sizes. And then if your browser still really doesn't support any of this stuff, it's an ancient browser, then it will ignore the sources altogether, and it will just use the image tag that we have in here. But that's it. I just wanted to kind of wrap this up, put a little closure on it. There are still some things that I might potentially like to do to this project. There are a few optimizations I might like to do. I would like to move it to a grid layout, but this is pro bono stuff that I think we're happy enough just the fact that this stuff went live, and hopefully you might have learned something by checking out the process of doing so. So that's it. Thank you, everybody.